Welcome, everybody, to our Lift Every Voice book club. We are here discussing Joy Unspeakable, Contemplative Practices of the Black Church by Dr. Barbara Holmes. And I am joined, as usual, by my wonderful partner in conversation, Claudia. Welcome, Claudia. It's wonderful to be with you again. And I just wondered if, just kind of what was your overall impression of the book before we get into the specifics?
I am always happy to be here. Thank you, Christine. This is one of the best spiritual books that I've ever read. From the preface, I've got, let me show you. I've got like all kind of, and I haven't even notes. I haven't even gotten to the, into the chapters that I was highlighting. It's fantastic. I think she brings a scholarship to the subject of the Black church that I rarely have seen. And not only is it scholarly, it's accessible as well. So I absolutely loved it. What about you?
Yeah, I did too. I think, I mean, I certainly learned a lot of things about the Black church that I didn't know before, but also just really appreciated her breaking open what contemplation might look like from that perspective, and in ways that maybe some of the other books we've read haven't been so direct about. And that idea of like, I'm just going to jump in with one of the quotes that I think I loved the most, because she talks about, this is on page 11, she says, today's wilderness can be found in bustling suburban and urban centers, on death row, in homeless shelters in the middle of the night, in the eyes of a hospice patient, and in the desperation of AIDS orphans in Africa and around the world. Perhaps these are the postmodern desert mothers and fathers. Perhaps contemplative spaces can be found wherever people skirt the margins of inclusion. Perhaps those whom we least value have the most to teach. I want to keep reading, keep reading. Yeah, and I just, I think because I have such a love of the desert tradition in particular in Christianity, and I feel like that desert call to go out to the wilderness to find this place of like the wild edges, and to meet God not in the center of things, not where like the dominant, where the government is, where the dominant kind of paradigm is, but out on the edges. And I was thinking about this book that I read a few years ago about desert spirituality by Belden Lane, called The Solace of Fierce Landscapes. And he weaves through that book the story of his mother dying. And it was just so exquisite the way he really lifted up that experience of being in the presence of her decline as this holy space, really. And I think she did such a beautiful job in the book of lifting up, all these experiences that the Black community in particular has gone through, that are harrowing and excruciating, and can be places that we can also see the face of the divine.
Yes. Yeah, I love that quote too. You asked me the question, in what unusual places have I encountered the wilderness and the desert? Before I say that, I do want to talk about the Black church experience. In my experience, I went to a church. I became a Christian at a Church of God in Christ, or at least I think I was a Christian before, but that's when I had like a huge life-changing conversion experience where I felt like suddenly there was the kind of God I could feel. So, and those churches, we strongly identified with, Jesus going into the desert, or even the pilgrimage of the Israelites, but there was no talk of desert mothers and fathers and these early Christians. We didn't really have that particular education.
Mhm.
And many of us evangelical Protestants were taught not to trust anything in the Catholic tradition or anything that resembled a high church tradition. So, that was all lost to us. And I did not even come across those things until I joined the Eastern Orthodox Church in my 40s. So, all right. That said, you asked me about an unusual place that I encountered, the wilderness or desert. I think as an African American, as a woman, as a person who spent most of my adult life in poverty, there were always wildernesses. It felt like, and even in my childhood was very chaotic. So in some way, it feels like my entire life was in the past was a wilderness. But I do want to share this one experience that I had. I have bipolar disorder too. And there have been times that my symptoms became unmanageable and I had to go into a mental hospital. There was one night, and my ex-husband, at this time, we were very newly married, and he had a really bad addiction to crack cocaine, which would take him out of the home and he could be gone for days. But often, he might leave in the evening and come back 6 o'clock in the morning. And like I said, we were newly married and this was really distressing to me. And so I was manic. And I did not know that I was manic because you don't always know when you're mentally ill. That's why right now I'm on really great medicine, so I don't have any symptoms at all. But I had to, in my life, figure out, how do I manage this illness? I need accountability people. I need people in my life that can recognize when I'm having symptoms, just in case I can't. Now I can tell when I'm having symptoms, but it took years to get there. Anyway, he got home and I was in such a rage. And it wasn't just because he'd stayed out all night again. It was because I was manic. And a lot of times, especially in Black women, there have been studies about this, mania presents as anger and irritability.
Mm-hmm.
So I just attacked him as soon as he got in the door, like a full on, he wasn't trying to fight me back. He was just trying to get me off of him, like a full on fist fight. And then I ran upstairs and then I took a bottle of pills. It's like, well, if I can't fight him, I'm just going to hurt myself. And it was such a driving negative force. So I ended up in a mental hospital. And I was completely wild-minded. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't sit still, which is, what happens when you're manic. But I really needed God. And it was a Christian rehab center, and they had Bibles. And so I couldn't read per se. So I'm just flipping pages and flipping pages. And then I just stopped flipping pages. And I looked down, and the scripture said, I am poor and needy, but the Lord hears me. And that immediately began to kind of soothe me. It didn't take the mania away completely, but I felt in that moment, God was right there with me. Later on, I looked for that passage in those exact words, and I never found it again. And I looked in all kind of versions of the Bible, and I never saw it like that again. And I don't know if I particularly saw it, but it was the exact word that I needed to hear. It was a contemplative moment where I found God in this very unlikely place.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story, Claudia. I have like chills thinking about that moment. Also, just thinking about um, your own ability to ask for support in your community to help you to identify those moments when, when things are, we don't have to do it all ourselves, and we can call on other people. And then to have that text sort of just enter in your life when you needed it most. And I think it speaks to Barbara Holmes, talking about how sometimes so often the contemplation in the Black tradition comes through in these moments of real pain and suffering and struggle, and it's like almost, I think she uses the image of a forge at one point, that place where that spark for the divine yeah is revealed in deeper form.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me see. What do I ask you? I'm trying to find a good segue from what we just talked about. All right, so we're still in the beginning, kind of, because that was just page 11. So back to the introduction. Dr. Holmes wrote about how congregants in the Black church, or she called it Africana, would be confounded by this notion of having contemplative practices. I would have never thought of that moment in the hospital at that time as a contemplative moment, or any kind of, nothing like that. I don't think I even knew what the word contemplative was at that time. It was not used in my community. So she writes about how people in the congregations that I came from would be like, what? Contemplative practices. So how do you think that, and this doesn't necessarily have to be in a Black church, how do you think that congregations that are not rooted in the Christian contemplative tradition would find some of the practices that are kind of soul staples to you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I feel like yeah, I mean, even in the Catholic Church, there's certainly a lot of um, parishes, that wouldn't necessarily be considered contemplative. And even here in Ireland, one of the things that I kind of grieve is not having a more contemplative place to worship, because the tradition here is sort of masses that go really fast. um, I think unfortunately it's very much tied to, the culture that we live in. And, this is productivity oriented, speed oriented, performance oriented kind of way of being. And so I think for a lot of people, if they haven't been introduced to a different way of worshiping and a different way of just slowing down and seeing that as a potential for divine encounter, then it it kind of grieves me to think that those resources are not more widely available to people. Do you have a sense of that? And because I know you go to a Black Catholic church, is it more of a contemplative community?
My priest is really extraordinary. He's African American. He's probably in his late 40s right now, and I've been there 12 years. So he was still in his 30s when I got there. He's a magnificent singer. So he does a lot of singing the prayers that I don't hear in other kinds of Catholic churches. He also raps, so he will, bust a rhyme like right in the middle of a homily. And he also is kind of rooted in meditation practices. So he will have us, often even in confession, he will have me breathe out my problems and then breathe in the Holy Spirit. So we do have kind of a contemplative community. And we also are very much like the Black churches that I grew up with that are not Catholic at all. The same songs, kind of that same vibe, like, we can lift our hands and praise God. So I think, and one of the things that I found really striking is that kind of the Black church is a Black church all over America. When I went to, and actually some of the people Barbara mentions in the book are people that I know, people that teach how African Americans are connected to the experience of the desert mothers and fathers. And that was in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. I also studied at the Institute for Black Catholic Studies in New Orleans. Pray for New Orleans, everyone.
Yeah.
Or pray for Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I got to see that, the way we worship with so much feeling, and these quiet spaces in between, and this moaning, it's all kind of the same. So, yeah, I find that really, really interesting. What was your question? Because I forgot.
I kind of forgot what my question was. No, it had just had to do, it was kind of going back to your point about, do you find contemplative ways of being in the church that you're currently in? And it sounds like
Yeah.
that's
Yes,
absolutely true.
absolutely. And it
Yeah.
might not be what you would think of as a contemplative practice,
Yeah.
or, the Jesuits would think of as contemplative practices, but they are.
Yeah.
I mean, we do have that too,
Sure.
but we definitely have this, what our priest calls an African and African American charism. So I probably said that wrong.
Yeah, no, it's I was even thinking when you said he breaks out into rap in the midst of his homily, how that could be a contemplative moment, because it's like taking you out of sort of the expected stream of consciousness into a more poetic way of being, which to me is always a contemplative moment when poetry enters in, in different ways. So
yes. All right. We're not going in the order, which is great because I like this organic
me too.
feeling. Let's talk about this moaning, this kind of lamentation that I just mentioned in our church experiences. So let's go to, this is chapter 3, page 50. I had this visceral reaction to that chapter, and it was called "Every Shut Eye Ain't Sleep." So the first time that I experienced this moan, it was with my great grandmother, who was actually one of the church mothers at this Church of God in Christ, where I had my conversion experience. And it wasn't at church. It was just like, sometimes she would just at home, washing the dishes, sitting in her favorite chair, just begin to, it would start as maybe a hum, and then it would just kind of get deeper. And I could tell she kind of goes to a place that I had not gone to at that point in my life. She died when I was 10. So I did not know what she was doing, but I knew she was connecting with something bigger than herself. And like I said, this could happen at any time where she's at the sink washing greens. It was not just, the pews in our church. And like I said, this was kind of a muted version. This was not like a full-on, howl. It is different than what our slave ancestors, would have experienced, including on the slave ships on the way here in the Middle Passage. But it always harkens back to that time and back to that suffering. So Dr. Holmes says that our contemplative practices, these Africana practices, have become largely disconnected from the suffering that brought them forth. Tell me about lamentation in your faith tradition. How do we get back to what Glennon Doyle calls brutal, which is brutal and beautiful together? How do we get back to that energy of lamentation and that moan when we have done all that we can to get past that,
Yeah.
we want to forget about those things. We want to forge ahead.
Yeah, I think it's also, living again in this culture of capitalism and productivity, like, you just want to get over it and move on, and I think about when my mom died, almost 20 years ago, and it was such an enormous time of grief. And yeah, and I have to say, even in the church, I didn't find that. I found people wanted to give a lot of, just little pithy sayings, or, people meant well, but they'd say things that weren't particularly helpful. And it was really that whole journey of grief that I went through that brought me to this deep appreciation of lament, of the role of lament, and how I think it's like deeply lacking in the church in general, no matter what tradition. And I do think it's largely a cultural thing. But it's interesting because I just started a course that I'm taking on the practice of keening with a singer named Mary McLaughlin. And keening is an old Irish practice that isn't done anymore, but they're trying to revive it. And it's a practice where basically women, were at the funeral and they would let out this moan. They would, wail and cry, and they were like the ones on behalf of the community who would help to express that grief. And I think about like the way trauma, impacts a body, and how that moaning that you're describing is such a practice of resilience and recovery. And like, the more that we stuff it all in, the more we think that we're going to be able to just move on with our lives, but really we're just, re-traumatizing ourselves. So there's like this incredible wisdom to this expression of that grief. And I would love to see more churches have spaces like where we could wail together, where we could, cry out together, where we could have these prayers and say like, what the, WTF, I won't say the words in our book club interview, but yeah. I know. I say it in my prayers a lot, but
that reminds me of something, and actually I had it for a different question, but I would like to read this passage from Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. And this is a section where kind of Baby Suggs, which was this kind of mystical Black woman, the Black older woman, she would call people to the clearing. And the clearing was the space out in nature where they would have these wonderful opportunities to be and to do that kind of keening. So this is from Beloved. When the warm weather came, Baby Suggs, holy, followed by every Black man, woman, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing, a wide open place cut deep in the woods, nobody knew for what, at the end of a path known only to deer and whoever cleared the land in the first place. In the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while the people waited among the trees. After situating herself on a huge flat-sided rock, Baby Suggs bowed her head and prayed silently. The company watched her from the trees. They knew she was ready when she put her stick down. Then she shouted, "Let the children come," and they ran from the trees toward her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them, and the woods rang. The adults looked on and could not help smiling. Then, "Let the grown men come," she shouted, and they stepped out one from among the trees, one by one from among the ringing trees. Let your wives and your children see you dance, she told them, and ground life shuddered under their feet. Finally, she called the women to her. Cry, she told them, for the living and the dead, just cry. And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. It started that way. Laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it got mixed up. Women stopped crying and danced. Men sat down and cried. Children danced, women laughed, children cried until exhausted and riven, and all and each lay about the clearing, damp and gasping for breath. In the silence that followed, baby Suggs, holy, offered them up to her great big heart. She did not tell them to clean up their lives or to go and sin no more. She did not tell them they were the blessed of the earth, its inheriting meek or its glory bound pure. She told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine, that if they could not see it, they would not have it. Here, I'm sorry, just one more.
Yeah, no. I'm loving it.
Here, she said, in this place here, we flesh, flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in the grass. Love it hard. Yonder, they do not love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes. They just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the color of skin on your back. Yonder they flay it. And oh, my people, they do not love your hands. They only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands, love them, raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them, pat them together, stroke them on your face because they don't love that either. You got to love it, you. And no, they ain't in love with your mouth either. Yonder out there, they will see it broken and break it again. What you say out of it, they will not heed. What you scream from it, they do not hear. What you put into it to nourish your body, they will snatch away and give you leavings instead. No, they don't love your mouth. You got to love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here. Flesh that needs to be loved, feet that need to rest and to dance, backs that need support, shoulders that need arms, strong arms, I'm telling you. And oh, my people out yonder, hear me, they do not love your neck unnoosed and straight. So love your neck, put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. But
that's exquisite.
I know Toni Morrison was just there's no writer that is like her. She's unmatched. And this very beautifully illustrates this tradition among slaves. And then it continued among people of African, well, I'll say captive Africans after slavery was abolished. We still were in the margins. We remain in the margins even now. But she so beautifully described Joy Unspeakable. In that passage right there, there was so much love and there was so much opportunity to be exactly who you are, to cry and to dance and to laugh. So yeah, I think that is an amazing passage.
Yeah, and I love that she holds that tension between the laughter and the dance and the grief and the crying, because I think something I often say when I'm teaching about this kind of stuff is that our capacity for sorrow and grief is in proportion to our capacity for joy and delight. And this sense that I think, like, what I've found in my own experience is that the more I can give myself over to those places of grief, then the more I'm actually able to experience joy in like a real, not just the pursuit of happiness, which to me is kind of a, I don't know, it's not a very inspiring phrase to me, but this joy is like this deeply embodied, like I love that image of flesh and, all the, like to love all the parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
And it actually kind of connects to one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because Barbara Holmes talks about this task of healing these transgenerational wounds, and how it demands this kind of radical love, and the things that don't get healing are handed down one generation to the next. And I wondered, in your own life and even in your own family, are you conscious and aware of some of those generational wounds? And I mean, to the degree that you're willing to to speak to that.
Oh yeah, I'm an open book. I'm saran wrap. I'm so transparent. Well, there's a lot of mental illness and addiction in my family, and often the mental illness drove the addiction.
Yeah.
And I am number 7 of 9 children. So it's really hard to imagine, in the 60s, a woman with 9 children being able to get out and be a career woman. So she really did not get to do the things that she had dreamed of doing as a young woman. And I think this is the same with my grandmother. They came from Middlesboro, Kentucky, to Detroit. Or they went to Detroit during the Great Migration, where a lot of Black Southern people, not just Black people, a lot of Southern people went to work in the auto plants in Detroit. And my grandmother actually worked in the auto plant. Couldn't drive, but she always had a new Chrysler. So I got to be a first and only in a lot of ways. I was the first and only to finish college. I was the first and only to really take my mental illness seriously enough to pursue getting help, taking medication, managing it in as best as I could, which was not good most of the time. In fact, I cannot remember a time that I was completely free of symptoms like I am now, since I was a teenager before the onset of bipolar disorder. So because I got an education, my children knew that it was possible to get an education. And they pursued college. I have a child that graduated from college. Marriage was not always a great thing in my family. I was married. I stayed married for a very long time. My daughter just got married. And I think, my father was a heroin addict and alcoholic. He was a largely absent father. But my ex-husband, Ken, he had his problems for sure, but he did stay in the home and help me raise the children. So I think, Barbara, there's a quote here about that, and it says, "There is no response other than radical love that is up to the task of healing transgenerational wounds. The healing begins within. Questions that we lay on those inner altars and that receive no response, hand it down to the next." So the questions, the inquiries that I got in my soul and in the quiet of my soul, I did try to answer them, not necessarily consciously, or it was conscious in the sense that I knew that I had to do something to escape all the poverty. And I still sometimes, struggle with money, but I knew that I had to do something, and that something was go to school. That something was get an advanced degree, not
Mhm.
just, not just get an associate's degree. I have a master's degree, and
A
first and
Master of
only
Fine Arts degree.
a master of fine arts, and that's a terminal degree, so I don't
Yep.
have to get a doctorate.
No, no.
um, I want nothing to do with a doctorate,
I would not
but
recommend going down that road, but that's a whole other conversation.
yeah, but it changed the course of my entire family. Now I've got nieces that are going to college. Writing books changed the
Mm,
course of my family. I have a niece that wants to be a writer. My mother wanted to be a writer. I got to do that, because she couldn't. My great grandmother was illiterate. Not only can I read and write, I've got books out. So those are the ways that that I dealt with these generational wounds, by being an example,
mhm,
whether I was conscious of the fact that I was example or not. Sometimes I was conscious of it,
mhm,
and sometimes I was just doing what I had to do. But it all came out of a place of loving myself. The self-love journey for me has been a difficult one, and self-love shows up in a lot of different ways.
mhm.
It's not just the bathtub with the rose petals and candles. uh, Self-love for me was and I had a lot of poverty. I was on welfare getting food stamps, but I went to school. I said, I've got to raise these babies. I need help while raising these babies, because Ken stayed an addict for a long time in our marriage, and I needed help, and I couldn't depend on him. So I got that help because it was out there, it was available. And in that time period, I went to school because I knew there would be a day when I wouldn't need food stamps, and my tax dollars would be helping another young woman who had a very difficult circumstances.
Mhm. Yeah. It seems like such a beautiful kind of witness to sort of your own natural contemplative gifts in terms of that like opening up to that love and that self-love that allowed you to do things that before were considered not possible for whatever reason. So that's
Yeah.
extraordinary, and yeah, I'm just grateful to hear that story. And I imagine your children are blessed by that in ways that you don't even know completely at this point, just because they still have more of their lives to unfold and fulfill.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, after reading that passage from Beloved, and I know that you're a writer yourself, though you don't write novels. Do you write novels? Are you sneaking a novel, man?
I do not write novels, no, but thank you for asking.
So I'm sure you've read novels. Is there an example of a novelist that you know of that preserves the Christian contemplative tradition in its pages?
It's a great question. I don't read a lot of novels. I will admit I'm more of a nonfiction person than fiction. But I was thinking about, for instance, like Sue Monk Kidd's, marvelous book, The Secret Life of Bees.
I love it.
Yeah, it's just such an extraordinary story, and yeah, the significance of the bees and the Black Madonnas in there, and and she has apparently well, I don't know how new it is, but a new book called The Book of Longings, which is about the secret wife of Jesus. Have you read that one? I haven't read it yet.
I haven't read it yet either.
But I feel, and even though she's left her very conservative kind of Christian roots, and I don't know whether she'd consider herself Christian anymore, but I feel like she does sort of still carry those stories and that tradition with her, and then gives another perspective. I was thinking there's another author I was reading. Her name's Robin Cadwallader. She's a British writer, and she wrote a book called The Anchoress, which was it's kind of like it's a fictionalized imagining of a woman who like Julian of Norwich, who goes into an anchorage and commits her life there. But it's, you know, it sort of tells the inside story and like imagines her struggles and, you know, the joys that she has and all of that. So those kinds of, I actually love historical novels as well. Yeah, I couldn't think of any others in terms of the contemplative tradition, but I do love a good story. Are there any that you come to mind for you in particular?
Graham Greene's book,
Mm,
The End of the Affair,
mhm,
is amazing in its Christian
mm,
themes. And not just novels, but there are writers in the contemplative tradition you may not expect, or they may not be called that. The late poet Franz Wright wrote beautiful poetry that came out of his experience um, being converted in the Catholic Church. So he still wrote about his difficulties with
mhm,
addiction. Um, I think his book is called Walking to Martha's Vineyard. It's something about Martha's Vineyard by Franz Wright. And these poems are just so beautiful and so full of God. Mary Carr, um, also a
mhm,
Catholic, uh, who wrote a book of poetry, which is also unexpected from Mary Carr, called Sinner's Welcome. And she writes about some of her experiences with, you know, what Barbara would call joy unspeakable. And going back to Sumant Kidd's
mhm,
Life of Bees, which is one of my favorite novels of all time, she was able to capture these Black women who were contemplatives.
yeah.
And I loved the depiction of Our Lady of the Chains.
Mhm,
And I think one of my favorite lines is not because she has chains and there were chains like wrapped around her, but because she breaks them. And if
mhm,
there's any race of people who are familiar with chains and the longing for the breaking of chains, it is African Americans or people who are the descendants and people who were captive Africans.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. It's it's making me excited to read Christina Cleveland's book about God as a Black woman, and when coming next spring for all of you who are anticipating. But that image of the Black Madonna as the one who, you know, is the seeker of justice, the one who sings the Magnificat, the one who helps in the journey of liberation. I wanted to read a quote from Joy Unspeakable about breath, because I'm thinking a lot about breath because I wrote a book on breath prayer that's coming out next month. And so her quote got me thinking about it in ways that I hadn't even thought yet, because she says, breath is the sustainer of life and also the vehicle for entry into the contemplative center. We take deep breaths to still our thoughts, center our being, and connect to a wisdom that permeates the universe. Now all of that I completely agree with, and I definitely feel like the breath is this doorway to this deeper connection to the divine. But then of course it got me thinking, and she mentioned, you know, of course, like Eric Garner, you know, saying I can't breathe, and George Floyd, I can't breathe, and the, you know, horror of that suffocation of life. And I'm not exactly sure what my question is, other than just wanting to really hold like the honor of the intimacy of breath, the tremendous value that it has to help us connect inward to that divine place, and how in these stories of these horrors that happen, how it might also help to empower us to seek more justice, to think about the breath can we all breathe freely, I guess, is the kind of the question that I'm asking myself. Mary Oliver asks in one of her poems, are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? And I love that quote. But then when thinking about it in the context of this, it's like, well, it's not just me. It's not just about me. It's also about who can't breathe freely. And and what do I do about that? How do I respond to that? Anyway, I don't know if it brings any images to mind for you or.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to find the part that was 149, right? There
Yeah.
is a part where she mentions this song that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement well, everybody will read it when they read the book, so I'm not going to just keep thumbing through pages. It's a song this group of poets and this young man wrote, and I actually listened to it last night. And around the time of, I think it was Eric Garner, and these kind of uprisings really started in our time. I'm not talking about the civil rights movement. I'm talking about the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
We begin to see these uprisings with Trayvon Martin, even though stuff had been happening always, like the entire time. We didn't have media like we have now. We didn't have CNN on all night long, broadcasting news from all over the country and all over the world. So around the time of Eric Garner's crying out, I can't breathe, I was in Walmart one day just shopping, and this group of protesters came inside the store and they were singing. They were not, tearing it down. They just walked through the aisles singing. And whatever was in the song, they did say the words, I can't breathe. It was like part of the refrain. And I just started crying. When I look at these, when I think about I can't breathe, these men were being murdered. So I can't take that, I can't take the trauma out of that. And I feel a trauma response when I hear the words, I can't breathe. It's not just the response to them. I looked at Tamir Rice's murder that was taped, and that cured me of ever looking at any of these tapes. I didn't look at George Floyd's crying out, I can't breathe. I didn't even like looking at still pictures. So it's really hard for me to think about, contemplation when I feel sad and helpless and angry. However, they're right. These men's lives were being taken, and the breath is the sustainer of life. And I don't think it's just the breath, just the privilege of still being here, the privilege of not having the police with a knee on your neck for almost 9 minutes. So, it's a privilege to be here. And I think even when we take the time to take these deep breaths, like my priest, where he says, breathe out some of those, breathe out shame, breathe out anger, breathe out, injustice, and breathe in the Holy Spirit. And then once you breathe in, once you consciously breathe in the Holy Spirit, breathe in beauty and the things that are nurturing and life-giving. When you breathe out, you can do so from a place of love. People don't really think about Black Lives Matter as a movement of love, but when you think of, who's going to get out on the street and link arms with Black people who are suffering? All of these white people all over the world at the Mall of America, shutting it down so that peacefully, and these were not riots and all of that. These were people who stood together out of the love of humanity and knowing we have to take care of each other. If one group of people is at risk, all of us are at risk.
Yeah.
There weren't a whole lot of Black people in the concentration camps, in the Nazi concentration camps. So out of our shared humanity, out of our love, out of the privilege of being here and being able to do something, I think we should. And I think you have to kind of stay in your lane. Everybody's not going to be able to go out into the streets to protest, but you can call your senator. There are people, because they had really small children, that couldn't go out. But, one of my friends was an artist. So she made art. She made social justice art. And I feel like at this time in my life that I'm a social justice creative, and that my writing will speak to social justice. Even if I don't say it, the justice is built in there.
Yeah, and I'm going to start bringing this to a close, but before I do, I wanted to have you mention that weeping wall that you had talked about as part of your social justice art, because it just sounds incredibly powerful and ties back to the lament and to a lot of the themes. I think it might be a nice way to kind of wrap up this conversation and to hear that imagery.
Oh, yeah. When I first started here at Carnegie Center, I'm the coordinator for the Kentucky Black Writers Collaborative. This initiative came out of the uprisings when Carnegie Center says, how are we serving the Black community? Are these spaces, mostly white spaces? Are we welcoming? And they decided that they needed to do better. So they hired me to come in. Black people can take classes for free, writing classes, language classes. Other initiatives that are for cost are, very, very deeply discounted. So there's no barrier. And this addresses the economic and educational and even publishing disparities that Black people face. I thought of the Weeping Wall because Kentucky is the home of Breonna Taylor. And you probably heard Breonna's name often mentioned along with George Floyd. And because she was a daughter of Kentucky, I wanted to honor her. In fact, when I got hired, she actually Breonna Taylor. And I was thinking, what kind of event do we do? We actually did have a memorial reading on the anniversary of her death. That was amazing. But I wanted to do something that could involve the whole community, that would kind of have writing involved, but also art, because I just love art and I love social justice art. So I thought about the Wailing Wall of Jerusalem and how they don't do it now, but they used to be able to stick their prayers and their lamentations and their poetry and their thoughts right inside the wall. And there's this Black kind of jazz song called Willow Weep for Me. And I wanted to use that image kind of connected to that song because I didn't want to appropriate the language of the Wailing Wall. Anyway, I wanted to do something like that where we could bring the community together to wail and to keen and to write our prayers and our poems and our lamentations. So we hired an artist to create what we call the Weeping Wall. And his vision kind of veered away from like a weeping willow, which is what we were thinking. So on the wall, there'll be this big fig tree. And fig trees have a lot of spiritual traditions kind of talk about the fig tree. And this man is African. He's from Kenya. He lives here in Lexington. And he brought all of these. So on the wall itself will be these fig trees, but above the wall are all these figures that are very stylized, that kind of look like African art. And people can walk through, and behind these figures, they'll be able to stick their prayers and stuff. So we don't have to put like holes in the wall. And these figures represent the ancestors. And when you go around the figures on the side of them, as you turn, you will see Brianna's face.
Wow.
And we wanted the community to come together for our grief, for our healing, because you can't heal until you grieve.
Yep.
So yeah, that is our weeping wall. We were supposed to do it next month, but we had to close the building to the public because of the Delta variant. But we're going to do it on the anniversary of Brianna's death on March 13th of next year.
Wow, that's so powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Claudia. What an extraordinary vision and gift. And what a delight to be talking about this book with you. And this has been talking about Joy Unspeakable by Dr. Barbara Holmes, Contemplative Practices of the Black Church. And if you haven't read the book yet, I highly recommend that you do and take your time with it and let it sink in. And thank you, Claudia. We'll, just a delight as always to be with you. And thank you.
You as well.